In the long, blood-stained chronicle of Rome, few names cast such a dark and enduring shadow as Lucius Aurelius Commodus. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king, the last of the 5 good emperors, a man revered for his stoic wisdom and his tireless devotion to duty. Rome had expected another golden age when the boy inherited the purple. Instead, what it received was a nightmare. The year was 180 AD. The empire stretched from the misty highlands of Britannia to the burning sands of Africa, from the Rhine and the Danube to the deserts of Syria. Never had Rome's power seemed so absolute. Yet into this vast dominion stepped a boy of 19, young, golden-haired, and draped in imperial robes. To the Senate and the legions, he appeared to be the embodiment of continuity, the living promise that Marcus Aurelius' vision would endure. But beneath the glittering exterior lurked something rotten, something that would soon twist the very heart of Rome. Where his father spent sleepless nights wrestling with philosophy, weighing justice and mercy in equal measure, Commodus devoted himself to indulgence, spectacle, and cruelty. He did not ponder the burdens of power. He reveled in its freedoms. The empire that Marcus had sustained with pen, sword, and reason, his son would desecrate with games, blood, and madness. From the very beginning, the contrast was unbearable. Marcus Aurelius had carried Rome on his back, writing the immortal Meditations even as plague stalked his camps and barbarians thundered across the Danube frontier. Commodus, meanwhile, abandoned the frontiers entirely, preferring the perfumed halls of the palace to the smoke and iron of war. It was as if the gods themselves had conspired to mock Rome. The philosopher's wisdom had begotten a tyrant's folly. Historians of the time, men like Cassius Dio, wrote with thinly veiled horror. They saw not a ruler, but a spoiled youth who viewed the empire as his private stage, a theater where he could act out fantasies that blurred the line between divinity and depravity. For Rome, this was not merely a change in leadership. It was the opening of a wound that would bleed for centuries. In Commodus, absolute power and absolute weakness fused together. His reign began not with the steady hand of governance but with the flicker of madness. And from that first day on the throne, the empire that had stood for nearly 1,000 years began to tremble, not from foreign invasion, but from the corruption festering within its own walls. Rome had placed its future in the hands of a boy, and that boy would drag it into the abyss. Whispers can corrode empires as surely as armies. From the earliest days of his youth, Commodus lived under a shadow of suspicion. While Rome called him the son of Marcus Aurelius, some muttered that he was no true heir at all. Rumor claimed that the Empress Faustina had betrayed her husband with a common gladiator, and that Commodus was the spawn of that illicit union. To a boy raised in the palaces of power, such whispers were poison. They seeped into his imagination, mingling with his vanity until they blossomed into something monstrous. If he was not his father's son, then he would become the son of the gods themselves. And so was born the delusion that Commodus was no mere mortal, but Hercules reborn, the living embodiment of divine strength, destined to rule not just Rome, but the very order of creation. This was no harmless fancy. He demanded that the world around him reflect his vision. Sculptors were commanded to carve his likeness in marble. Commodus draped in the lion skin of Hercules, clutching a wooden club as if it were the thunderbolt of Jupiter. These statues multiplied across the empire. In forums, temples, and marketplaces, citizens awoke each morning to the smug face of their emperor gazing down upon them, cast in the garb of a god. But the theater did not end with stone. Commodus himself began appearing in public clad as Hercules, his muscled frame wrapped in lion's hide, his eyes gleaming with fanatic conviction. Senators who once addressed emperors with dignity now found themselves bowing before a man who demanded worship, not respect. In his mind, Rome itself was no longer the center of civilization. It was merely a stage for his divine performance. The Senate, that ancient body that had guided Rome for centuries, was forced into complicity. Their silence became his validation, their obedience his chorus of praise. To refuse him was to invite ruin, for Commodus tolerated no dissent. He believed the empire existed not as a republic, not as a tradition, not even as a family inheritance, but as his birthright as a god among men. And yet, beneath the lion's skin and the posturing, the gladiator's son still lingered. Perhaps that is why he clung so fiercely to the myth of Hercules. It was not enough to be emperor. He needed to be immortal. He needed to silence the whispers forever. But in trying to bury rumor beneath the weight of divinity, Commodus instead birthed a legend of madness, one that would stain Rome's soul for centuries to come. The business of empire bored Commodus. Governance, administration, diplomacy, these were burdens he could not be bothered to bear. Instead, he handed the affairs of Rome to freedmen and sycophants, men whose loyalty was purchased not with honor, but with access to his debauched court. In their hands, the empire's machinery rusted, while Commodus transformed the imperial palace into something far more sinister. What had once been the beating heart of Roman dignity became, under his reign, a brothel of unimaginable scale. The marble corridors that had echoed with the footsteps of emperors now throbbed with the laughter of courtesans and the cries of the humiliated. Ancient values, gravitas and dignitas were swept aside, replaced by an endless carnival of indulgence. No one was safe from his appetites. The most sacred figures of Rome, the Vestal Virgins, sworn to chastity and honored for centuries as guardians of the city's eternal flame, were whispered to have been coerced into his games. Nobles and senators' wives were summoned to his chambers, their dignity stripped away under torchlight. Even children were not beyond the reach of his predations. Families trembled at the sound of imperial messengers, for they knew such summons rarely meant return. Ancient sources speak in hushed tones of his 300 concubines, carefully chosen from every corner of the empire, paraded before him like livestock. Exotic dancers from the east, patrician daughters from Rome, slaves from Africa and Gaul, all forced into a grotesque theater of submission. Commodus did not simply seek pleasure. He sought domination, delighting in role-play that twisted Rome's most sacred traditions into obscene parodies. Fertility rites became carnivals of debasement. Marriage ceremonies were mocked, their vows drowned beneath waves of lechery. The palace itself became a stage for this depravity. Lavish banquets stretched into nights of cruelty. Guests, whether noble or slave, were ordered into humiliating roles. Commodus would assume the mantle of gods, Jupiter, Apollo, but most often Hercules, demanding that his partners worship him with every act, every word, every glance. Those who failed to feign enthusiasm faced punishment that was as inventive as it was merciless. Roman historians struggled to capture the horror. Some dared not describe the details, perhaps out of respect for the victims, or fear of immortalizing the emperor's crimes. But what survives is enough to chill the imagination. A palace where sacred vows were broken, where innocence was corrupted, and where the supreme ruler of Rome reveled in turning the empire's noblest symbols into instruments of degradation. Thus, the heart of Rome, once a temple of power and dignity, was desecrated, brick by brick, torch by torch, until it became a grotesque monument to the lust of one man. The Senate, once the proud heart of Rome's republic and the enduring symbol of its dignity, found itself dragged into the dust under Commodus' reign. The emperor, swollen with delusions of divinity, no longer content to call himself Hercules reborn, now sought to prove it with blood. And so, the senators of Rome, men whose ancestors had governed the world, were forced to watch as their ruler turned the arena into a grotesque stage of humiliation. In the Colosseum, where once the clash of steel had carried the weight of honor, Commodus strutted forth clad in the lion skin of Hercules, wielding a heavy club. But these were no contests of skill or courage. They were pageants of cruelty. His opponents were no seasoned gladiators but men bound and helpless, wild beasts weakened or chained, their fates already sealed before the spectacle began. The emperor slaughtered them effortlessly, grinning as the crowd, commanded by fear, roared in forced applause. And at his side, seated under the blazing sun of Rome, the senators themselves were compelled to attend. Draped in their white togas, they sat stiff and pale, forced to clap for a parody of heroism. They could not look away. Each cheer was a dagger twisting in their dignity. Each spectacle a reminder that the power they once shared was nothing but ash. Their shame was Commodus' delight. He relished their humiliation. The Senate had once been the highest body of governance, a council that checked even emperors. Now Commodus reveled in their degradation. He summoned them into the amphitheater not as lawmakers but as prisoners of spectacle. Their status as Rome's aristocracy meant nothing in the emperor's twisted theater. The more they squirmed under the sun, the more he smiled. Yet his cruelty went further still. He inverted the sacred order of Rome. Slaves and gladiators, men of the lowest station, were elevated for a day, handed positions of mock authority, while noble senators were forced into servile roles, reduced to trembling spectators in games designed to debase them. It was not enough for Commodus to be adored. He needed to see his enemies, real or imagined, broken in spirit. The arena, once a place where Rome celebrated its courage and discipline, had become a chamber of degradation. What unfolded under Commodus' rule was not entertainment, but ritualized humiliation, a deliberate crushing of dignity. And with each spectacle, the old order of Rome decayed further, its noblest traditions drowned beneath the thunder of false applause. In Commodus' Rome, honor was inverted, power was mocked, and the Senate, once the pride of the Republic, was reduced to little more than a captive audience for the emperor's madness. The empire's treasury, once the pride of Rome, carefully nurtured by generations of emperors, was drained in a matter of years. What had taken decades to build through conquest, taxation, and trade was squandered by Commodus in nights of indulgence. Gold that should have funded legions, repaired aqueducts, and secured borders instead disappeared into orgies that stretched on for days. Lavish feasts where exotic animals, imported delicacies, and endless entertainment devoured the wealth of the empire like a raging fire. But even Rome's coffers had limits. When the last coin clinked into the hands of his sycophants, Commodus turned to cruelty masked as law. Wealthy citizens, long the backbone of Rome's economy, found themselves suddenly accused of treason. Senators, equestrians, and merchants alike were dragged before false tribunals, condemned on fabricated charges, and stripped of their fortunes. Their estates were seized, their families disgraced, their names erased, all to fill the emperor's pockets and fund his next spectacle. The emperor's greed knew no boundary. Even the sacred offices of Rome were sold like trinkets in a market. Governorships, military commands, even priesthoods were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Power was no longer earned through merit, loyalty, or honor, but bought with silver and gold. Those too poor to bribe the emperor's agents were crushed. Those rich enough to purchase favor wielded it with corruption and impunity. The social fabric began to tear. Priests, once guardians of Rome's faith, were compelled to defile their vows, dragged into obscene ceremonies that mocked the gods. The sanctity of temples was stained, leaving worshippers horrified. Parents lived in perpetual dread, hiding their children away lest Commodus' gaze fall upon them. Some sent their sons and daughters to remote provinces. Others disguised them in poverty, praying obscurity would spare them from the emperor's grasp. Panic spread through the streets. Merchants whispered of bribes demanded at every turn. Senators avoided gatherings, fearing the jealous eyes of informers. Families cloaked themselves in silence, afraid that a careless word might bring imperial wrath. Rome, the city that had once prided itself on order, on discipline, on law, now trembled beneath a fog of paranoia. What unfolded was not simply economic collapse, but collective trauma. The empire's wealth was gone, its traditions corrupted, its people broken in spirit. Commodus had not only emptied the treasury, he had emptied Rome itself, stripping it of confidence, of trust, of the very values that had sustained it for centuries. And in the ruins of dignity and prosperity, the mad emperor sat enthroned, reveling in the chaos he had unleashed. While Commodus drowned himself in games of blood and spectacles of cruelty, the lifeblood of the empire, the army and its borders, was left to rot. Rome, once famed for its iron discipline and unmatched legions, found its military decaying under the weight of neglect and humiliation. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, who had once stood as the emperor's shield and the empire's symbol of strength, were forced into roles so degrading they could scarcely be called soldiers. Commodus reduced them to playthings in his twisted theater, ordering them to participate in mock battles and degrading ceremonies designed only to amuse his insatiable vanity. Men who had bled for Rome now found themselves ridiculed in public, dressed in costumes, made to bow before gladiators or act as servants at imperial banquets. The result was devastating. Discipline collapsed, loyalty corroded, and morale turned to ash. Beyond the city's walls, the consequences of this decay became apparent. The frontiers of the empire, stretching along the Rhine and the Danube, were left vulnerable. Commodus, disinterested in strategy or defense, pulled commanders away from their posts to curry favor at court. Legions were left underpaid, underfed, and unprepared. The once mighty Roman war machine, famed for its precision, became a hollow shell of its former self. The Germanic tribes, long the restless enemies of Rome, seized the opportunity. They launched raid after raid across the frontiers, torching villages, slaughtering farmers, and tearing down the illusion of Roman invincibility. With the empire's soldiers disheartened and their commanders distracted, these tribes pushed deeper, testing the limits of Rome's collapsing defenses. What once would have been repelled with steel and discipline was now met with hesitation and cowardice. Inside the empire, the decay was mirrored in the economy. Trade routes grew unstable as merchants feared the roads. Agricultural estates along the borders fell into ruin, their laborers scattered or slain. Each raid weakened not just Rome's defenses but its food supplies, its markets, and its very capacity to sustain itself. This was more than military weakness, it was systemic rot. Commodus' neglect turned the Praetorian Guard into jesters, the legions into beggars, and the borders into open wounds. Rome's enemies could see what its citizens already feared. The empire that had once marched undefeated now stumbled under the weight of its own corruption. And while the Germanic tribes carved their path through neglected provinces, Commodus sat secure in his palace, playing Hercules in the arena, blind to the fact that the empire's walls were already crumbling. The barbarians did not need to storm Rome. Rome was devouring itself from within. As Rome drowned in the filth of Commodus' excesses, its people searched desperately for meaning beyond the corruption of the throne. The imperial palace had become a theater of sin, the Senate a hollow chorus of submission, and the army a mockery of its former self. In this vacuum of dignity, the people turned their eyes away from Caesar and toward the heavens. Though still outlawed, Christianity began to spread like wildfire through the alleys, workshops, and households of Rome. To the oppressed and the enslaved, it offered not the hollow promises of a mad emperor, but the vision of a righteous God who would one day bring justice. Here was hope, that the cruelty of Commodus was temporary, that beyond the suffering of this world lay a kingdom eternal, where tyrants would be punished and the meek lifted high. Secret gatherings in catacombs whispered of divine vengeance, prayers rising in candlelight for deliverance. Among the soldiers, another faith took root. Mithraism, the cult of the unconquered sun. In Mithras, soldiers found a god who demanded discipline, loyalty, and brotherhood, the very virtues Commodus had mocked and destroyed. In the dim chambers beneath the earth, legionaries pledged themselves to sacred oaths, hoping to reclaim the honor their emperor had stripped away. While Commodus paraded as Hercules, the legions looked to a god who valued sacrifice over spectacle. Even the ancient gods of Rome, once invoked in temples of marble and incense, began to change. Priests, forced to endure the emperor's blasphemous parodies, now preached of morality, of justice, of gods who judged the soul rather than merely accepted sacrifice. Traditional paganism bent beneath the weight of Commodus' crimes, reshaping itself into something sterner, something that spoke of punishment and righteousness. In every corner of the empire, the same conviction grew: the gods, or perhaps a greater god, would not remain silent forever. The emperor who claimed divinity would one day face true divinity, and the verdict would be merciless. This belief, whispered in markets and muttered in homes, became a form of resistance, a secret comfort against the omnipresent fear. The irony was bitter. By desecrating Rome's sacred traditions, Commodus had unwittingly prepared the ground for new faiths. His cruelty created thirst for justice. His blasphemy stirred hunger for purity. His madness revealed the need for truth beyond earthly power. In trying to make himself a god, Commodus had driven his people into the arms of gods who promised his destruction. And so, beneath the marble monuments of a decaying empire, a spiritual revolution stirred. The throne rotted, but belief endured. Faith became the weapon of the powerless, and the seed of a future Commodus could neither foresee nor destroy. By the year 192 AD, Rome had had enough. The empire teetered on the edge of collapse, its people suffocating beneath Commodus' madness, its senate humiliated, its army rotting. Yet the emperor himself seemed untouchable, wrapped in the delusion that he was Hercules reborn, destined to rule forever. It would not be Rome's enemies who struck him down, but those closest to him, the very hands that once served his whims. Among them was Marcia, his mistress. She had endured the terror of his court, living in constant fear that his affection might one day turn to rage. With her were Eclectus, the chamberlain, and Laetus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Together they conspired in secret, whispering under torchlight, knowing that failure would mean death by unspeakable torture. Their first attempt was subtle. At a banquet, poison was slipped into the emperor's goblet, a draught strong enough to kill a bull. Commodus raised it to his lips, drank deeply, and for a moment the conspirators dared to hope. But fate was cruel. The emperor convulsed, vomited, and survived. Rage flickered in his eyes, though he had not yet guessed the betrayal. The conspirators knew there could be no second chance. The final act unfolded in the emperor's own bathhouse. Commodus, naked and unguarded, sank into steaming waters, the flicker of torches painting his skin in gold and shadow. He was at his most vulnerable, and yet still consumed by fantasies of divinity. In his mind he was Hercules, unconquered, eternal. But no god could save him now. Into the chamber stepped Narcissus, a professional wrestler. His task was simple, brutal, and final. As the water steamed around them, Narcissus lunged. Strong arms wrapped around the emperor's neck. Commodus thrashed, his body flailing in panic, water splashing across marble tiles. The emperor who had murdered helpless victims in the arena now found himself helpless, clawing at the air, his strength meaningless against the grip of a man determined to end him. There was no roar of the crowd, no triumphant applause, only the choking gasps of a mad ruler whose delusion collapsed in his final breath. Stripped of crown, stripped of lion skin, stripped of every pretense of divinity, Commodus died as he had lived. Consumed by vanity, destroyed by betrayal, remembered not as a god but as a monster. And so ended the reign of Commodus, not with the glory of Hercules, but with the ignominy of a strangled tyrant, drowned in his own madness and left lifeless in the very palace he had corrupted. The death of Commodus did not bring peace. It unleashed a torrent of pent-up rage. The Senate, at last free from his suffocating shadow, moved swiftly. They declared him a public enemy of the state, invoking the harshest punishment in Rome's political lexicon, damnatio memoriae. His name was struck from inscriptions, his titles erased from records, his statues toppled and defaced. It was as though Rome itself tried to purge his existence, to scrub away the stain of his madness. But memory is not so easily destroyed. Commodus' reign was burned into the empire's soul. His debauchery, his cruelty, his delusions of divinity, these things could not be erased by chiseling his name from marble. The people had lived through his nightmare, and the scars he left behind would fester long after his body had cooled in the bath. The damage was profound. His corruption had gutted the Senate's dignity, shattered the army's discipline, and mocked the gods themselves. By degrading the very institutions that had sustained Rome for centuries, Commodus opened a door that could never again be closed. Historians would later mark his rule not as a passing storm, but as the true beginning of Rome's decline, a rot that spread until the empire itself collapsed under its weight. Modern scholars, with tools unknown to the ancients, confirm the horrors described by contemporaries like Cassius Dio. Archaeological evidence speaks in silent testimony. Coins stamped with his grotesque titles, statues portraying him as Hercules littering the empire, pleasure gardens and amphitheaters built not for Rome's glory but for his indulgence. Even fragments of graffiti tell the tale, mocking the emperor who fancied himself a god while his people starved. Medical historians, piecing together descriptions of his violent mood swings, paranoia, and sadism, see clear signs of deep psychological disturbance. Some propose what we might now call antisocial personality disorder. Others see the imprint of trauma or inherited madness. Whatever the diagnosis, the result was unmistakable. A ruler unhinged, wielding absolute power with no restraint, dragging the world's greatest empire into chaos. For the Senate, condemning him as a monster was not enough. They needed to make his very name a warning. But history is merciless. In trying to erase him, they ensured he would be remembered, not as a god, not as a hero, but as the emperor who shattered Rome's illusions of invincibility. And so Commodus endures. His reign remains a grim reminder that the fall of civilizations does not always come from without. Sometimes, it begins from within, born from one man's madness, and an empire's failure to stop him. Commodus had longed to be remembered as a god, immortal and glorious. He renamed months after himself, built statues that proclaimed his divinity, and performed in the arena convinced his victories would echo through eternity. But history is merciless. The man who crowned himself Hercules reborn is remembered not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale, a tyrant whose madness scarred Rome forever. His reign stands as one of the darkest chapters in the empire's thousand-year history. He did not fall on the battlefield defending his people. He did not perish in triumph, surrounded by loyal soldiers. Instead, he died naked and gasping, strangled by a wrestler in his own bath. It was the perfect, grotesque ending for a ruler who had reduced Rome to theater and bloodsport. The legacy of Commodus is not glory but ruin. In 13 short years, he squandered Rome's wealth, humiliated its senate, degraded its army, and desecrated its gods. He turned the palace into a brothel, the senate into a mockery, and the Colosseum into his private stage of cruelty. By doing so, he weakened the very institutions that had sustained the empire for centuries. His reign planted seeds of decay that would grow into the full collapse of Rome in the centuries to come. Modern historians, with access to archaeological evidence and the insights of psychology, confirm what ancient voices recorded with horror. Commodus was a man consumed by delusion and cruelty. His behavior bore the marks of severe psychological disturbance. Paranoia, sadism, narcissism, made infinitely more dangerous by unchecked power. He was proof that one man, armed with absolute authority, could unravel the fabric of civilization. And that is his true legacy, a warning. Commodus reminds us that the veneer of civilization is fragile, that its institutions, traditions, and values can be destroyed when society bows to the will of a single madman. Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, discovered too late that power without conscience leads only to ruin. For the Romans, Commodus was not just an emperor. He was a nightmare made flesh. His name, chiseled from monuments, survives not in reverence but in infamy. He wanted to be immortalized as Hercules. Instead, he endures as the mad emperor, a symbol of how quickly greatness can collapse into barbarism. The lesson is as sharp today as it was in 192 AD. Civilizations are not destroyed only by enemies at their gates, but by corruption, vanity, and madness from within. Commodus was Rome's warning, and perhaps ours as well.